Hello everybody, my name's Kimberly and this is Off-Road Reactions. Today I'm reacting to a video from someone that I don't suppose I'd describe them as a friend of mine, but somebody who in, I shall say, a previous life I had a little bit to do with. Les Hiddens is known by most people as the Bush Tucker Man. And Les is still around, but not producing TV at the moment, but he still has a website for Bush Tucker if you want to go and subscribe to that. I met Les probably about the time or shortly after he filmed some of these episodes, was when he had this white Land Rover with the white 910 antenna on the front. And shortly after that, he and I were together at an ARB open day, I guess you could call it, and we talked about a project where I would lead tours and Les would be the kind of expert commentator, because Les was getting to the point where he didn't want to really do things like run tours, but he wouldn't mind, being involved in a way that would kind of teach people stuff. Anyway, it never came about. Lots of things happened both in Les's life and mine, but we do know each other, and I remember watching a lot of these with a lot of fascination. Now, I know Les has an incredible respect for Ludwig Leichhardt, and rightly so. I think it's fair to say that there were probably some possibly more capable bushmen who came after him. Not to say that Leichhardt wasn't very capable, he was extremely capable. I would describe Leichhardt as a polymath, and someone myself who's been described as a polymath, I kind of have a lot of respect for that. He knew a lot of things about a lot of things, and he kind of applied that knowledge wherever he went, and he observed lots of things. He was a brilliant learner of new things. So one day I'm going to have an expedition, and it's going to be called In Search of Leichhardt. And we're going to go and look where people think he might have disappeared. It might have to be a multi-year kind of operation because there's lots of the country to cover. Anyway, let's have a look at this episode from the Bush Tucker Man, Series 3, Episode 7, The Passionate Prussian.
Queensland's Gulf country is as flat as it is spectacular. A lot of the country around here is taken up with cattle properties, but being remote doesn't mean you have to be by yourself. Many people in the outback have come to rely on HF radio.
Good morning everybody, this is Cairns School of Distance Education, broadcasting on frequencies 5300, 5865 and 11015.
Good morning, Mrs. Ogilvy.
Good morning. Yes, Sophie?
I've got some exciting news for you today.
Oh, that sounds great. What's that, Sophie?
We've got a special guest here, Bush Tucker Man, Mrs. Ogilvy.
Great, Sophie.
Yes, Mrs. Ogilvy.
Good morning, how are you, Ava?
Very well. Is that the real Les Hiddens, the Bush Tucker Man?
Crikey, I hope so, Ava. We're in strife if it's not.
That's great. What are you doing at Rutland Plains?
Well, I'm here at the moment following up the explorer Ludwig Leichhardt, and I find him quite a fascinating bloke because we came through this Rutland Plains area, 1845, around about then, and something rather... I've always wanted to follow Leichhardt's journey.
All right, I'm going to stop it there just for one purpose, really. I remember when HF radio was absolutely ubiquitous in the outback. And now it's been replaced by internet and sat phones and the like. And even very few homesteads now really rely on the HF radio. But if you travel around and look at the historic places, you look at Old Endado, for instance, you can see that Molly had the HF radio at the top of her desk, even after she had the telephone. So, and I remember traveling and listening to things like the School of the Air. It was just so great to be traveling along and listening to these kids doing classes. It was open. You could listen to it as long as you got reception. And you might have seen there that on Cape York, that particular station, which came out of Cairns, the call sign of which I can't remember now, was on 5300 kilohertz, or 5.3 megs, if you like. And that's pretty much a universal morning, afternoon kind of frequency, covers a very large part of Australia. So you could hear it from all over the place. And then also you had the kind of cockatoo sessions, typical on 2200, 2200 kilohertz in the evenings. And I remember being way down on the road past Haddon Corner somewhere. Just trying to remember the name of the road. It wasn't Cudillo Downs Road. Anyway, I'll remember it. My memory's fading on me, I think. Anyway, we're listening in there one night, myself and my partner, and it was just this hilarious conversation between these two old guys on Cape York about, the sagas that went on that particular day, bending the chainsaw, all kinds of antics. It was just fabulous to listen to, and I really miss it. Now, that's not to say that HF radio is dead. Those of you who travel with me and Olsen's Tours and Training will know that I'm passionate about HF radio. I think it's one of the most wonderful ways to communicate, and there's lots of ways that you can do that, and maybe I'll do a video on it very shortly. Anyway, I miss those days.
Because he was so passionate about exploration. On this, his first trip, he took 7 men. Naturalist John Gilbert, Calvert, Murphy and Roper, and Philp, and 2 Aboriginals, Brown and Charlie. Charlie was the real character of the expedition, and we catch up with him a bit later on. This amazing journey started in September 1844, when the expedition left Toowoomba in Queensland and then travelled all the way up Cape York, through the Gulf of Carpentaria and on to the British garrison at Port Essendon. The aim was to find a way to the north and to prove the viability of pastoral land.
Gee, I don't think we dip cattle like that anymore. I think it's just a spray on.
For the future. I'm starting this trip here at Rutland Plains because this cattle property on Cape York has a special place in the history of Leichhardt. Up to now, the many Aboriginals they came across were more curious than threatening. However, all that was about to change. What happened next created a whole turning point for the expedition. For some reason or other, and we're not really quite sure about the whole thing, the Aboriginals decided to put in an attack around about 7 o'clock at night. They ended up spearing Roper and Calvert, and they killed Gilbert.
You gotta love the sight, almost sight gags about a very serious subject. He's stabbing his sausages as each man is named, each man that was speared. He's just got this funny sense of humour. Those of you who have watched the show will know.
Poor old Calvert, he copped a spear through the groin. Stopped him riding a horse for a while, I can tell you.
There you go.
The next day they buried Gilbert, and feeling that they might be attacked again, they decided to move on. Many of the rivers round here already had names, but not all of them. And Leichhardt was pretty keen to fill in the gaps.
All right, I want to pick up on that point. This is clearly going to be the Gilbert River. I might spoil it for you here, but anyway. So how did these rivers have names if Leichhardt was, the first European to travel through this country? And the answer is most of them were named from the sea. And so lots of people were very clever at kind of understanding where the mouth of the river might be if they came across that river somewhere closer to the coast. So Leichhardt would have understood the possibility, the probability that a watercourse that he came across was one or other of those named sources. He was extremely good at understanding where he was, despite navigation being not what it is today. He often calculated his distance from the coast by the time of arrival of the sea breeze, which is an incredibly smart thing to do in the time. It's not perfect, but it's just a great show of what I spoke about before, this man being a polymath. He understood that the convection would cause the sea breeze to arrive inland later in the afternoon, and by the strength of the breeze, he could kind of estimate roughly how far he was from the coast. It's not science, but it's close to it, and it's really, really good. Amazing.
So the next major river he came across, guess what he called it?
Sorry, spoiled it for you.
There have been some pretty strange things that have happened around this Gulf country, and this train line is one of them. It was built for the gold rush era in the 1880s, and it's only 150 kilometres long. It was supposed to link up with the rest of the Queensland Railway, but it never happened. These days it's mainly used by tourists. Leichhardt had come out from Prussia a few years earlier and immediately set out on short trips to learn as much as he could about the Australian bush. It was his enthusiasm and his new skills as a bushman that would eventually get him through. They'd all been on the road now for 10 months and were starting to feel the effects of what had been a difficult journey. Of course, the longer Leichhardt's expedition went on, the fewer rations and provisions he had. By the time he got round this Gulf country here, he'd run out of salt. It's a great one for scrounging round the countryside, Leichhardt. And round here, he resupplied himself. Apparently he was looking for salt, but some of the men weren't real keen on it. When he bunged it in the stew that night, some of them went crook at him because they reckon he put in too much salt. Anyway, that's it. It was Brown and Charlie's job to find food.
I should point out too, because I know I get this question a lot in the desert trips. People will say, oh, let's taste the salt on the salt pans in the desert country rather than the Gulf country. So we're not talking about tidal clay pans, and we're not talking about clay pans that, like you might experience in the Gulf, where you got fresh water coming down off slopes and then evaporating. That is salt, but what you will encounter in a lot of the desert regions, places like that Lake Disappointment, the clay pans in the Simpson Desert, for instance, is predominantly composed of gypsum. So I can tell you now, gypsum does not taste very nice compared to salt. So just watch that.
And to act as guides, but Charlie was a bit cheeky quite often, which caused Leichhardt to sack him one time, only to reinstate him the next day, of course.
You know, one of the great interesting things about this Leichhardt expedition is the fact that it was privately funded, not like a lot of the other exploration that was going on at the time. See, people like Major Mitchell and Captain Charles Sturt and Kennedy and those types, they all had government funding backing them. Poor old Leichhardt, he had to crank up the funding himself, so he got a whole bunch of patrons and sponsors. They tipped in money hoping that he might find something. I guess they were interested in grazing country and that sort of thing. And as he went round the place, he named different places after those sponsors and patrons. And you see this creek here, which turns into a river a little bit down the stream there a bit further. This is called Robinson River, and it's named after the bloke Robinson in Moreton Bay, who helped him kit out the expedition in the first place. One of my favourite little rivers, this one.
By the time he'd moved around the bottom of the Gulf, he was way behind schedule, and his men were grumbling and wondering if they'd ever get to Port Elizabeth. He was now heading northwest, where I'm going, to an area that's surrounded by beautiful lagoons.
I remember camping like this when I was younger, and you don't see this much anymore, canvas tarps. I wish you did, actually. They're a whole lot better than poly tarps for a whole bunch of reasons. And I'm sure that this is all probably ex-army stuff. Those of you who don't know, Les was a major in the army. I actually was talking to someone the other day who was a lieutenant colonel, retired, and we were remarking about a couple of people that we knew, ex-army. Okay, now that the phone has rung, yeah, so I was talking to a couple of people who were, I was talking to someone who was ex-army, a lieutenant colonel, about a few people we knew, and we got around to speaking about Les. And I knew Les had been a major. I knew some of the work that he'd done. I knew he'd been in Vietnam. And this person told the story that a lower ranking person, I think actually a corporal, but correct me if I'm wrong if you ever get around to watching this, Les, but was a bit concerned that Major Hiddens lets his hair grow a little bit. He was always a bit doing his own thing, I think was the words that were used by this lieutenant colonel. So the corporal said to him, sir, do you know where the barber is? And Les gave the guy instructions. Yeah, just to go this way and there and that way. But I think the corporal, or whatever rank he was trying to say, sir, I think you should get your hair cut. But of course, that might not have been appropriate. So dropping a hint. Anyway, that's an interesting story about Major Les Hiddens.
Whenever I'm going to stop for a few days, I like to build a decent camp, which is both simple and comfortable. It's not a bad idea to have something to do two jobs. These wooden planks here hold my jerry.
Actually, it's a really good idea to have things that do two or more jobs. And some of you have heard me speak about this before. Think very carefully when you're packing stuff, you know, about if you're trying to build something or make something or install something for a purpose, think about what other purpose it might serve somewhere. It's a really good idea. Helps keep the weight down, helps make things more comfortable.
Cans together in the trailer. But they got another use, making life in the bush just that bit better.
Setting up camp, a lot of hard work at times, but it's really worth it if you're going to stay somewhere for a number of days. This lagoon here is right beside the Roper River. I'm going to have a look around here, because right here, we're right slap bang in the middle of Leichhardt country. There's a few things around here I want to have a look at over the next few days.
Leichhardt was said to be a bit of an oddball.
Now you'll also notice that Les has got his swag rolled up and leaning against a tree. He hasn't made the mistake that a lot of beginners make if they camp in swags. And look, I see all these swags being sold as swags. I'm sorry, a swag is the traditional swag. If it's got poles and mosquito net and legs and other things, as far as I'm concerned, it's not a swag. A swag is a bedroll. And if you're talking about the traditional bedroll, then you don't put it out before you go to sleep in it. It's a great place for snakes and other creepy crawlies to go hide. So you always leave your swag rolled up until you're ready to get in it. Just a lesson for those who would like to maybe camp in a more traditional way without the need for all the hoops and legs and other paraphernalia.
But he really was very practical, and his camps were always well organised. He'd occasionally stay for a few days in one spot, so that he could kill a bullock and dry the meat to preserve it. He made sure he wasted nothing. He even collected the fat, using it to grease the saddles and the harness.
Old habits die hard. When Leichhardt came through this country here, he encountered lots and lots of Aboriginal people. And on one occasion, he actually got talking to them. Well, sort of talking anyway. And he gave them a bit of a present. Some of his spare horseshoe nails. But they came back at him and they said, hey, we don't want them like this. We want them bent so we can make fish hooks out of them. Obviously, those people had somewhere or somehow encountered steel before, so they knew what it could be made into. All this country around here is so rich in game and bird life and all the rest of it. It supported quite a lot of Aboriginal people back in those days. And if you look very, very carefully, you can still see signs of that era. Oi, come and have a look at this. I've seen a lot of rock etchings in my time, but I've never seen anything like this. Look at this, these feet are absolutely superb. And there's lots and lots of them around all these rocks here. You can see that they've been chipped into the rock, and somehow the wind's moved the sand across and it's all collected there, and they really jump out at you. Come on, I'll show you something else.
Called petroglyphs, these engravings preserve Aboriginal art. You see, these rocks are in a riverbed, and during the wet, they're covered by a mass of water, which would normally wash away painted surfaces.
Back to Mr. Leichhardt. By the time he crossed this river here behind me, they were trying out all sorts of bush tucker, including this stuff here, which is a resin out of the tree. Take it back to camp and boil it up and chew it. I've tried it before, it's a bit like eating glue. I think I'll save me appetite for something better.
Thought I might try and catch a few yabbies. Knock up a bit of a yabby pot here. This place here used to be a cattle property, so you can find all sorts of junk lying around the place. I found this old flour drum up the way there. Back in Leichhardt's day, of course, they didn't have drums of flour, they had bags of flour. And he lost about 60 pound of it by the time he got here. So he's running short on flour as well as everything else. Banged a few holes in it with the back of the pick. Should work like a beauty. Lump of meat on a bit of wire, which is what the yabbies want. See how it goes.
Leichhardt was a great observer. Looking through the Aboriginal camps, he soon figured out just what plants you could eat. However, the job of catching birds and animals was mostly up to the Aboriginal guides, Brown and Charlie.
One day Charlie came down to one of these billabongs here at the Roper, looking for ducks or flying foxes, I forget which, doesn't matter. He looked in the billabong, he saw this monster, this animal, this strange looking thing come out of the water with horns on it and all sorts of things. I reckon there was no way he was going to get in that water. He went back to camp and told Leichhardt and the whole rest of them. They sort of didn't take much notice of it. In fact, next day Brown went up to the same waterhole and he saw a crocodile, so in his journal Leichhardt tends to dismiss Charlie's monster as being a crocodile with Charlie added horns to it. Well, there are crocodiles in here. And I guess it's just as well Charlie didn't get in the water because it might have been goodbye Charlie. But I'm not so sure about this monster business. I think Charlie saw what Charlie saw. We might be able to figure it out.
This is the mighty Roper River, named by Leichhardt after one of his men, John Roper. The river was to be the expedition's next big challenge.
Poor old Leichhardt had a real dilemma. He had to somehow find himself on the northern bank of the Roper River, but it's a pretty mighty river. How do you cross it? Well, the only thing he could do, and that's exactly what he did do, was move along the southern bank, trying to look for a way to get across. And then he got to this creek here, and they had an absolute disaster here. Charlie moved the horses into the creek, and 3 of them drowned. Leichhardt was absolutely devastated, but there's nothing much he could do. So they kept on moving on down that way. I'll tell you one thing that wasn't here when he came through. That's this stuff here. That's a bush passion fruit, introduced from South America. And these days, it's a real pest. It's spread everywhere. That's the Roper River Bar crossing.
Before he explains that, most of you might just know it as Roper Bar.
This location to Leichhardt is both good and bad. It was bad in so much as just back there a little bit, he lost yet again another horse. Slipped in off the steep bank and drowned. I guess the men and the beasts and the horses and everything were all coming to the end of their tether. They're just too weak. But he got up here and he saw exactly what he was looking for. A rocky bar stretching all the way across to the northern bank there. And that let him walk all the way across there, get on that northern shore and start heading up for Port Essendon. I guess in many ways it's not a bad thing he did find the bar, because this water, even though it looks inviting, is absolutely full of crocodiles. Oh, I got some.
Yeah, so these are different to the inland yabbies, as you've seen the inland yabbies with the big claw. Now, I worked in aquaculture for quite a while, actually. And if you do some digging around, you might find a paper that I co-authored about aquaculture. Pretty certain that this species here that he's holding in his hand is Macrobrachium rosenbergii. And I think it's sometimes called the giant river prawn. Right across the Indo-Pacific, you'll find Macrobrachium rosenbergii, and it's great eating. But it's not the same as the yabby that you might find in other places.
Have a go at that. These things, when you cook them up, just exactly the same as prawns. Terrific eating, these things. Had a thought the other day. This is probably the first time that salt from the Gulf country has been carted over here to the Roper River since Leichhardt did it way back then.
They'd now been travelling for 13 months and they're still a long way short of their goal. Leichhardt only had a few bullocks left as he got closer and closer to Port Essendon. Leichhardt had maps with him that had been surveyed from the coast, which is pretty much all they showed. So as he went along, he filled in some of the details. Today, there's one map around here that's got a really weird name.
This one here, if you have a look at it, called Snowdrop, which is rather a strange name for any map in the middle of the Northern Territory. And down here, we've got a Snowdrop Creek. Leichhardt actually walk right through this stuff here. But how come we've got a name like Snowdrop for a map in the Northern Territory? For years that puzzled me. And a few years back I happened to read Leichhardt's journal. I found the answer. Remember though that Leichhardt, when he left Toowoomba, started off with something like 16 bullocks to eat along the way. And by the time he got here...
Now, before Les tells the story of this map and the name Snowdrop, I just want to tell a brief theory about some of the stuff that I think is important with respect to Leichhardt's final expedition. There are lots of people that speculate about where he may have perished and where he may not have perished, based on the fact that some bullocks have made it back from other expeditions from middle of nowhere, essentially. You know, there's walk back along the way they came and they come back to wherever they came from. And that didn't happen with the bullocks that Leichhardt took on his last expedition. So not this expedition, the expedition where he vanished. And my theory is that it wasn't because they were so far away when he vanished, although that is the possibility. I personally think that he went all the way over to the West Australian coast. Anyone who knows the northern part of the West Australian coast would realise that it would have been a chore like no other to get from there to the Swan River at Perth. I believe he followed Sturt Creek, Lake Gregory, and the waterholes that are now the Canning Stock route, probably down to about, I don't know, well, 37-ish kind of territory, and then went across through, you know, gorge country, rockhole country to the coast. And that would have been an incredible journey. There is evidence that he may have made it to the coast. And then, realizing the dilemma that he was in, came back to the center of Australia, and I believe he perished. My personal opinion is he perished somewhere on the northern or western side of the Simpson Desert, trying to follow a river south to shortcut his journey home. Now, that's entirely speculation based on a whole bunch of different things. But the point is, if he was using his bullocks for food, which he did, and he'd used them all up, they couldn't come home because they'd all be used up. They'd either have died or they'd been eaten. So anyway, nice little interlude there about my thoughts.
Here, he was down to 3, and he killed one of them. Killed him in that creek there, that Snowdrop Creek. The bullock's name was Snowdrop because he had a little white dot on the front of his forehead here. So I guess Snowdrop got not only a map named after him, but also a creek. This rocky plateau became the next obstacle. As spectacular as it looks, Leichhardt described the view as sickening, complaining of large loose boulders that caused the animals to slip. Nowadays it's called Kakadu, a national park on the World Heritage List, and it's more than likely that Leichhardt was probably the first European visitor. Today it's a breeding ground for something like 1/3 of Australia's known species of bird life. Arnhem Land has been home to Aboriginal people for thousands of years, and a record of that time can be found in the caves around here.
Oh yeah, they're both there.
These decorated hands may have originated from gloves worn by the British or even the Dutch visiting Australia's north.
What do you reckon that is, English or Macusson boat? Macusson. By the time Leichhardt got to this neck of the world, and it's a tremendous bit of country here, he started to encounter Aboriginal people who'd obviously met Europeans and Macusson traders and those sort of people around the coastline before. That became very obvious when one of them came up to him and called him Commandant. But also you get rock art galleries like this that reflect that connection. Well, from here, Leichhardt had to find his way right up there to Port Essendon, weave his way through all these billabongs down here. I won't have the same trouble he did. I won't need the Aboriginal guides, but I better get going if I'm going to get there.
There are some really fascinating stories about Aboriginal art in the northern part of Australia, including a reindeer. If you want to know more about that, maybe you should come along on one of our tours. So that might be a good time to mention the sponsor of this video, Olsen's Tours and Training. Do go check out Olsen Tours and Training and see if there's a tour that you'd like to come along on. And yeah, you'll find Olsen's Tours and Training at www.olsenstoursandtraining.com.
They'd now been travelling for around 15 months, presumed to be lost. As they moved further north, friendly Aboriginals guided the exhausted party towards the garrison and Victoria settlement. Today, the best way to get there is by boat, or one of these. I've been out here a few times, and it never ceases to amaze me. A more lonely place in Australia is hard to imagine, as the site for this settlement was on a strip of land thousands of kilometres away from the rest of the colony. Built in 1838, Victoria settlement was established to be a...
Can you imagine being in this place in the 1830s? So 1770 was when Captain Cook arrived. Right, and 1830, we've got this settlement here. 1788, the first fleet arrived in Sydney Cove. It's difficult to imagine, just what it would be like to be based somewhere like here with the passing shipping trade that was coming to the new colony. It's just boggles the mind. You can't travel overland to, the only other places of settlement in Australia at the time, none of which, by the way, were in the northern part of, for instance, Queensland. The parts of Queensland where I come from were settled in 1860s, 1861, that kind of time. So, it was a long way to somewhere like the Darling Downs, Brisbane. I can't remember exactly when Bowen was settled. It was probably one of the first places in that part of Queensland. But this is a long way from anywhere.
Port base for British ships travelling to and from New South Wales. However, after 11 years and enormous hardship, the British government decided to chuck it in. Disease and poor nutrition had claimed the lives of 60 people, men, women and children. Mid-December 1845, Leichhardt and his men staggered into Victoria's settlement. The lost explorers were enthusiastically greeted and supplied with much needed provisions and clothing.
This settlement here is only one of a number that the British tried up here in northern Australia. Had another go at one over there earlier on, over there at Fort Dundas and Melville Island and Raffles Bay over that way, and then finally this one here. And one by one they all failed. I suspect that Charlie's monster originated from here, because what happened was those three settlements stocked themselves with water buffalo, and as the settlements collapsed, the buffalo were let run loose and that sort of thing, and gradually they spread all the way down through this top end country right down to the Gulf of Carpentaria, and that had been going on for something like 20 years before Leichhardt even came up here, so the spread was all over the place. And what Charlie saw down there in that lagoon down on the Roper River was in fact a water buffalo standing in the water up to here, therefore he couldn't see any legs or anything, but he's got this great big head, his back out of the water, and like he said, two big horns. Well,
I think
that's
it's a
my
pretty
theory
good
anyway.
theory. And this is why it's really, really interesting to read the explorers' journals and to kind of read the other history of Australia that coincides with those journals. It's something that I haven't done for a little while, but I spent a lot of time doing before I set up my business. And I think Les is probably on the mark there.
Leichhardt stayed here for a month before catching a ship back to Sydney. They'd covered an incredible 5,000 kilometres of unexplored country with the loss of only one life. However, 2 years later, he set off again.
I'm going to leave it right there because I'm going to talk more about the expedition in which Leichhardt disappeared, and I hope to turn it into at least a tour, maybe several tours. All right, thanks for watching.